Part 1. Blind into Battle, September 2001 to December 2001. Chapter 1. Something has happened to Khalid. In the late summer of 2001, Amrullah Saleh flew to Frankfurt, Germany, to meet a man he knew as Phil, a CIA officer. Saleh handled intelligence liaisons, among other tasks, for Ahmed Shah Massoud, the legendary Afghan guerrilla commander who was then holding out against the Taliban and Al Qaeda from a shrinking haven in the northeast of his country. At 28, Saleh had a stern, serious demeanor. He was clean-shaven and kept his dark hair cropped short. He spoke English well, but deliberately, in a sonorous accent. Saleh typically met his CIA handlers at a hotel. He and Phil discussed a cache of spy gear the CIA had organized for Massoud. The delivery included communications equipment and night vision goggles that would allow Massoud's intelligence collectors on the front lines to better watch and eavesdrop on Taliban and Al Qaeda fighters. The CIA had been training and equipping Massoud's intelligence directorate for several years, but the program was limited in scope. Under the policies of the Clinton administration and more recently the George W. Bush administration, the CIA could not provide weapons to support Massoud's war of resistance against the Taliban. The agency could only provide non-lethal equipment that might aid the agency's hunt for Osama bin Laden, the fugitive emir of Al Qaeda, who moved elusively around Taliban-ruled areas of Afghanistan. One shipment had included a giant remote-controlled telescope. At another point, the CIA considered supplying Massoud with a balloon fixed with cameras to spy on Al Qaeda camps. But between Afghanistan's heavy winds and the possibility that neighboring China might misinterpret the dirigible, they decided against it. Frankfurt was a logistics hub. The CIA's supply lines for Massoud were jerry-rigged and constrained by caution at headquarters. By early 2001, Langley had ordered CIA officers to stop flying in Massoud's helicopters because they weren't judged to be safe enough. Phil and his colleagues usually delivered equipment directly to Dushanbe, where Saleh ran an office for Massoud. Tajikistan was recovering from a bloody civil war, and there was occasional political unrest in the capital. That could make it difficult for CIA officers to travel there, but for the most part they found a way. Once in a while, however, they had to ask Saleh to pick up equipment in Germany and carry it the rest of the way himself. The CIA officers involved knew the German government was highly sensitive about anything the agency did on German territory without informing the BND, the principal German intelligence agency. But the supplies to Massoud were uniformly non-lethal. Some of the equipment might skirt the borders of export licensing rules, but it was not obviously illegal, as arms and ammunition would be. Massoud's lieutenants were experienced smugglers. Sometimes Saleh would have to figure out how to transport CIA equipment on his own. This made Saleh nervous. He did not relish answering the questions of German police or customs officers at Frankfurt Airport. "Where did you buy this?" He would have no answer. "Do you have any receipts?" "No." "What will you use these night vision goggles for?" It would be unwise to mention the Afghan war. "How did you obtain the funds to buy a $5,000 satellite phone and subscription?" Saleh had become an intelligence specialist only recently, but he was an avid student of the profession. In 1999, Massoud had selected him and 8 other senior aides and commanders to travel to the United States to attend a CIA training course put on by the Counter-Terrorist Center under strict secrecy rules. Few people outside the center knew about it. The curriculum partly covered the arts of intelligence, identifying and assessing sources, recruitment, technical collection, analysis, and report writing. The paramilitary courses covered assessing targets, maneuvering and communicating in the field, and so on. In Nevada, the trainees climbed a mountain with a telescope to practice reconnaissance operations in conditions that replicated those in Afghanistan. The training reflected the CIA Counter-Terrorist Center's hope, a quixotic one in the view of many agency analysts familiar with Afghanistan, that Massoud's guerrillas might someday locate and trap bin Laden, even though the Al Qaeda leader rarely traveled to the north of the country, where Massoud's guerrillas were. At the CIA school, Saleh was a bit bored by the paramilitary instruction. He was more drawn to the craft of intelligence collection. He wanted a fuller understanding about intelligence systems and methods. He peppered the CIA officers on the faculty with questions. He found a few who were willing to give him extra time, and he tried to understand how the CIA worked. When the course was over, Saleh went to Borders to buy a stack of books about spy services and intelligence history. Since then, he had earned respect at the CIA. The officers with whom he worked assessed Saleh as tough, disciplined, honest, and professional, if also a bit young to command authority in Afghan society, which venerated age and experience. To solve his shipping problems in Germany, Saleh tried to draw on his self-education, particularly concerning the methods of Israeli intelligence. Mossad had networks of helpers around the world, not just employees and paid agents or informers, but friends of the service who could be called upon for ad hoc favors. Saleh telephoned an Afghan-German businessman in Frankfurt whom he had cultivated for such assistance. "I have something I need you to do. I need your help," Saleh said. The man suggested they meet at a hotel. "I won't lie," Saleh said when they were settled. "It's equipment. If I'm lucky, I can take it out of Frankfurt Airport. If I'm unlucky, they will confiscate it." The gear was not lethal, Saleh added, but it did constitute war equipment. "Brother, I had offered to help you, but not in smuggling," the businessman said. "This is not smuggling," Saleh pleaded. "It's all plastic. There's no explosives, nothing. There are some goggles." Still the man declined. He wished Saleh luck. Saleh transported the gear, which was about the size of a half sofa, to Frankfurt Airport. He booked himself on a flight to Tashkent, Uzbekistan, from where he would transfer to Dushanbe. This was typical of the struggle against the Taliban in which he and Massoud were engaged. They were fighting a DIY, do-it-yourself, guerrilla war. Massoud and his men had resources. The commander and many of his top lieutenants kept bank accounts in London and elsewhere abroad, according to CIA reporting, and Massoud was reported to control just over $60 million in London accounts. Yet they were effectively at war with the Taliban and Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state with a gross domestic product in 2001 of more than $70 billion. At the Lufthansa counter, Saleh filled out forms. Then he answered many questions about his equipment. Had the CIA tipped off the Germans, and had the Germans agreed to go easy? He never knew. After a long colloquy, Lufthansa demanded only a considerable sum of money, which it calculated based on the weight of Saleh's cargo. Amrullah Saleh had grown up in Kabul in a poor family from the Panjshir Valley. He was the youngest of 5 brothers. At 7, he was orphaned. Like many Afghans who came of age during the Soviet occupation of the country during the 1980s, he knew political violence intimately. One of his brothers disappeared, executed by unknown parties. Another of his brothers, who was an Air Force officer, fell to an assassin in Kandahar. At 22, Saleh joined Massoud's guerrillas in the Panjshir Valley. The Panjshir is a gorge that occasionally widens into a valley. It slices from the north of Kabul toward Tajikistan. A tight kin network of ethnic Tajiks inhabited the valley and scratched out livings as farmers, emerald miners, smugglers, and traders. By the time Saleh arrived, the Soviets had withdrawn their combat forces from Afghanistan, leaving behind advisors to shore up an Afghan communist regime headed by President Najibullah, a former secret police chief. The war between Mujahideen guerrillas and the communist government in Kabul continued, but increasingly the guerrillas fought among themselves. They anticipated victory and competed for its prospective spoils. Massoud was perhaps the most politically savvy faction leader, the one who followed precepts of successful guerrilla leaders throughout history. He was a brilliant battlefield tactician, but he was equally concerned with food supplies and security for his civilian followers, and with his popular credibility. Because Saleh was bright and had already taught himself English, Massoud's lieutenants sent him to Pakistan in 1992 on a course provided by the United Nations titled Post-Conflict Reconstruction and Management. Saleh studied how to run humanitarian operations in the eventual service of northern Afghanistan. Gradually, Saleh became the youngest man in Massoud's circle of advisors. In the mid-1990s, he moved to Russia. He learned Russian and tried to evaluate the potential for a new partnership with Afghanistan's former tormentor. Russia had fallen into political and economic chaos under President Boris Yeltsin, and Saleh returned to the Panjshir unconvinced that the Russian government could provide much help. Later, Massoud dispatched Saleh to attend peace negotiations with the Taliban sponsored by the United Nations, and Saleh began to work with the CIA. The main CIA unit tasked to interact with Massoud's guerrillas was called Alec Station. Its mission was to capture or disrupt Osama bin Laden and other Al Qaeda leaders. The station comprised about 25 operations officers and analysts, and it was based at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Richard Blee, an experienced operations officer from the Africa Division of the Clandestine Service, took charge of Alec in 1999. He inherited a group under rising pressure. After Al Qaeda bombed American embassies in Africa in 1998, CIA officers working with foreign intelligence services from Egypt to Jordan to Kenya to Pakistan conducted raids on the homes of suspected Al Qaeda members and associates around the world. They seized computer drives and documents in Arabic, Urdu, English, and other languages, and then dumped the materials on Alec Station, to be sifted line by line for clues and names that might help to thwart upcoming terrorist attacks. By 2001, the station's analysts transmitted an average of 23 formal reports per month to the FBI about Al Qaeda. The work combined high stakes with numbing detail. Senior officers found that if they did not work from 7 a.m. until 6 p.m. or later, Monday through Friday, plus a few hours on Saturday and Sunday, they could not keep up with the traffic. Blee had served multiple tours working the streets in unstable capitals. His CIA tours had included postings to Bangui, the capital of Central African Republic, Niamey, the capital of Niger, Lagos, Nigeria, and Algiers. Blee was tall, with sandy hair. Some of his colleagues found him aloof and entitled. He was a second-generation CIA officer, pegged by some to rise high in the agency eventually. He was cerebral and well-informed about international affairs, comfortable working in ambiguous conflict zones. Considering the problem of Al Qaeda's sanctuary in Afghanistan, a landlocked nation where the United States had no embassy, Blee strongly favored working through Ahmad Shah Massoud, the most effective Afghan commander on the ground, who shared the CIA's antipathy toward bin Laden. Blee had led a covert team of CIA counterterrorism officers who flew into the Panjshir to meet Massoud in October 1999. "We have a common enemy," Blee had told the commander. "Let's work together." He and CIA officers who followed provided power supplies for Massoud's intelligence equipment, better intercept gear, and an encrypted communications link that connected Massoud's intelligence aides to Alec Station to send and receive secure typed messages. There was one encrypted terminal in Dushanbe and a second in the Panjshir. Massoud assigned Amrullah Saleh to be Blee's main contact. The following year, Al Qaeda suicide bombers supported from Afghanistan struck an American warship, the USS Coll, in the Yemeni port of Aden, killing 17 American sailors. After that, in December 2000, Blee had drafted plans at the request of the expiring Clinton White House for a $150 million covert action program to arm, equip, and train Massoud for missions beyond the bin Laden hunt, to help him fight the Taliban more effectively. Yet many American and European intelligence officers, generals, and diplomats did not see Massoud as a viable partner against Al Qaeda. Recalling the miserable fates of Imperial Britain and the Soviet Union, they did not want to entangle the United States in Afghanistan's civil war. The Panjiris had committed mass killings during a period when they shared power in Kabul during the mid-1990s. They continued to smuggle gems and heroin to fund their war. Massoud's warnings about Al Qaeda could be dismissed as an element of a self-interested diplomatic campaign to win international aid for his losing factional struggle. Blee became one of Massoud's most ardent defenders in Washington, regarding the commander as a great historical figure, comparable to Che Guevara. Massoud's wispy beard had grown gray, and dark bags hung beneath his eyes, but he remained highly energetic on the battlefield. Massoud's argument was that the United States had a huge problem in Afghanistan, much bigger than bin Laden. The essence of Massoud's message was, "You've got all of these extremists. You've got the Taliban, and I'm the only friend you've got in this neighborhood." Blee agreed with Massoud entirely, but he could not win the foreign policy argument in Washington. He told Massoud, "Look, nobody gives a damn about Afghanistan. They care about bin Laden. I can't talk to you about taking over the government of Afghanistan. I'm only empowered to talk to you about getting bin Laden. But we can build on that. Who knows where that goes?" Massoud understood. All of his allies and foreign suppliers were constrained in one way or another. Alex Station ran some of its covert operations against Al Qaeda, including Predator drone surveillance flights, from the CIA station in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Amrullah Saleh worked with officers there as well as those in Virginia. That summer of 2001, amid the frustration over America's hesitancy to back Massoud fully, Saleh fell into conversation with one of Rich Blee's colleagues, Jim Lewis, a counter-terrorist center case officer posted to Tashkent. Lewis urged Saleh to watch The Siege, a 1998 movie about terrorism written by the journalist and author Lawrence Wright and starring Denzel Washington and Bruce Willis. In the film, a terrorist group carries out bombings inside the United States, and the government imposes martial law. Lewis predicted, "Something similar to that will happen to my country, but nobody is listening to us." From Frankfurt, Saleh returned to Dushanbe. He met Massoud there on Friday, September 7th. Massoud had arrived to speak with a visiting Iranian delegation. In the absence of more robust American support, Massoud depended on Iran, India, and Russia for weapons, money, and medical aid. Iran was perhaps his most reliable ally. Iranian Revolutionary Guards and intelligence operatives worked in northern Afghanistan alongside Massoud's guerrillas. While they were together in Dushanbe, Saleh asked Massoud, "Where shall I send the equipment?" He was referring to the CIA's latest gear. Massoud told him to keep it in Tajikistan for the time being and to invite some Panjiri colleagues up to Dushanbe. "You can train them," Massoud instructed. That weekend, Massoud returned to Afghanistan, to his compounds near the Tajikistan border in Khoja Bahadin. Two Arab television journalists carrying Belgian passports had been waiting there for days to interview the commander. On the morning of September 9, 2001, Mohammed Arif Sarwari, who was commonly referred to as Engineer Arif because he had studied electronics at a technical university in Kabul before dropping out to join Massoud at war, was at work in his basement office, where he oversaw a wire-strewn rat's nest of ultra-high-frequency radios, intercept boxes, and satellite telephones. Arif was Massoud's senior intelligence operations leader, in charge of all reporting agents and intercept collection in the day-to-day war effort. Arif was a gregarious, energetic man with thinning hair. A CIA officer who worked with him called Arif scruffy, verbose, crafty, corrupt, and a good, reliable partner. He was born to a Panjiri family in Kabul in 1961 and grew up in Karte Parwan, the neighborhood where Ahmad Shah Massoud had also lived as a boy. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, Arif was still in school. But in 1982, he left for the Panjshir to join the rebellion. Initially, he worked as a guard and a clerk, but after a year, when Massoud learned that he was from a trusted Panjiri family, spoke Russian, and knew electronics, The commander asked him to set up a listening post in the Panjshir to monitor Russian military communications. The British Foreign Intelligence Service, MI6, had recently provided Massoud with a Jaguar high-frequency radio network and computers. Someone needed to organize all this equipment and make tactical use of the intercepted messages. Arif became the Panjshir Valley's de facto intelligence chief, often at Massoud's side. Besides managing radio intercepts, he developed human sources. During the war's late stages, Massoud built secret ties to an Afghan communist faction in Kabul known as the Carmelites. When the communist regime collapsed in the spring of 1992, Massoud seized Kabul. For the next 4 years, Massoud served as Afghanistan's Minister of Defense, while engineer Arif worked as the number 2 at the Afghan Intelligence and Security Service, formerly known as Khidmati Alayati Dalati, or Government Information Service, but notorious across the country by its acronym, KHAD. Its officers carried out brutal interrogations and thousands of extrajudicial executions during the communist era. Arif kept some Soviet-trained communist veterans in place. After the Taliban took Kabul in 1996 and Massoud retreated back to the Panjshir, Arif maintained contact with some of the former KHAD officers he had worked with. Some of them now served as agents behind Taliban lines. Arif sent small satellite phones to agents in Kabul and Kandahar and arranged for them to cross into Panjshir to meet Massoud personally. "Are there Pakistani troops?" Massoud would ask. "What about Al Qaeda? What are their ammunition supplies?" Kabul was particularly easy to penetrate because of its mixed ethnic makeup and its proximity to the Panjshir. One of Massoud's reporting agents was the head of all intelligence for the Taliban in Kabul. Massoud owned thousands of books and was devoted to Persian poetry. In the early hours of Sunday, September 9th, he stayed up with an old friend, a longtime political aide named Massoud Khalili, and read poetry aloud in a bungalow, as the two of them did regularly. The next morning, the commander summoned engineer Arif to ask what should be done about the United States, how to advance that relationship, what the issues were, what strategy to pursue. The Communications and Radio Intercept Center Arif ran was located on the ground floor of a concrete house he used as an office when he stayed in Khojabahoudin. There was a reception room upstairs. Massoud said he was finally ready to grant the visiting Arab journalists an interview. The journalists set up their tripods and cameras in the room just above Arif's intelligence center. It was by now almost noon. Arif was in and out. At one point, the commander took a call on his satellite phone. He learned that a Taliban and Al Qaeda force had attacked their front lines near Bagram airfield, and that 8 Arabs had been seized. He asked Arif, "See what you can learn about the fighting." Arif went downstairs. He was on the satellite phone when suddenly an explosion knocked the phone out of his hand. At first he thought it was a bomb dropped by one of the Taliban's handful of fighter planes or an enemy rocket launched from long distance. Such attacks were commonplace in Khojabahoudin. Then Arif smelled smoke and heard guards shouting. He ran upstairs to the reception room and saw Massoud's body lying inert, blood everywhere. His friend Khalili, who had been translating for the commander during the interview, also lay unconscious. Arif called out for the commander's Toyota Land Cruiser. He and other men carried the victims outside. They laid Massoud on the back seat of the Land Cruiser and put Khalili in the third-row seat. As they drove off, Arif called for a helicopter. He ordered the driver to head for a landing area 5 or 6 minutes away. By coincidence, there was a helicopter in the air nearby. "It's an emergency," Arif said. "We're going to need that helicopter, but tell them not to shut down the engines. We're coming." They loaded the wounded men aboard. Arif tried to prevent the helicopter pilots from learning what had taken place. He told them to fly straight to a hospital not far from Khojabahoudin that had been built by the government of India and to land in the garden. Then he returned to his office and raised General Fahim Khan, Massoud's most important military commander, on a satellite phone. Arif used the code word they employed for Massoud. "Something has happened to Khalid," he said. September 9th is Independence Day in Tajikistan, a government and business holiday, so Amrullah Saleh was at home when his phone rang. It was a nephew of Masood's. "Don't waste time packing. You are ordered to rush to the airport and fly to Kulyab, a city in Tajikistan about 120 miles southeast of Dushanbe." Saleh left immediately. In Kulyab, still following cryptic instructions, he made his way to a hospital. He found 4 or 5 of Masood's commanders and aides there. A little later, General Fahim Khan arrived. Engineer Arif turned up near sunset, his clothes still covered in blood. A liaison officer from Tajikistan's intelligence service joined the group, as did an officer of Iran's Revolutionary Guards. Abdullah, a medical doctor and the longtime foreign policy advisor to Masood, who ran many of his overseas liaisons, had been summoned from a diplomatic trip to New Delhi. For the first time, the commanders told Amrullah Saleh the truth. Masood was dead. His corpse was inside the hospital. They had flown the body up from the Indian hospital on the Afghan border. In the garden, they talked about what to do. There were now about a dozen of them gathered. They were in shock. Some of the men wept. Al Qaeda and the Taliban had tried to kill Masood many times before, but he had seemed invincible. The 2 Arab suicide bombers, who had been prepped for their martyrdom by Al Qaeda, had hidden their explosives in their camera equipment. As they talked, the Panjshiri leaders concluded quickly that they would have to lie publicly about Masood's death. They would have to put out word that he had only been lightly injured and would survive. Otherwise, they feared that their fighters on the front lines at the mouth of the Panjshir Valley, facing a mass of Taliban and vicious, death-seeking Al Qaeda volunteers, would panic and retreat, allowing the Taliban to swarm into the valley and carry out a slaughter. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards advisor with them volunteered that if it seemed too difficult to keep the secret of Masood's killing while his corpse was lying in Kulyab, the Guards and Tajikistan's intelligence service could transfer the body to Mashhad in Iran, and keep his death secret for 1 month, 6 months, whatever you need. Others in the group suggested that they move the corpse back to the Panjshir Valley. Yet this carried the danger that the truth would leak out prematurely before they had prepared commanders on the front lines. Abdullah had no doubt that the resistance would collapse if news spread that Masood was gone. The officer from Tajikistan intelligence said there was a morgue nearby the hospital. They could secretly keep the body there for at least a few days while Fahim consulted with commanders. They all decided that was the best plan. They also agreed to inform the 6 countries that were most important to their cause about what had really happened: the United States, Russia, Iran, India, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. They gave instructions to Amrullah Saleh: call the CIA, tell them the truth about Masood's assassination, and ask for weapons. The argument Saleh was to deliver to Alex Station was, in essence, if resistance to the Taliban and Al Qaeda means something to you, we can hold, we can fight, we will fight. But if you wanted to help Commander Masood only, he is not with us anymore. To compensate for his loss, we need more help than in the time when he was alive. Saleh flew back to Dushanbe and put a message in for Richard Blee at the CIA's Counter-Terrorist Center. He said he needed to speak urgently. When Blee called on an encrypted line, Saleh followed the script given to him at Kulyab. He confirmed to Blee that Masood was dead, but emphasized that Panjshir's leaders wanted to keep the news secret as they tried to forestall a collapse of their lines. After they hung up, Blee notified the White House. Within hours, news services quoted anonymous Bush administration officials saying that Masood had probably been assassinated. Saleh called back. "You are causing me great difficulty with my comrades," he said evenly. "My instructions were to keep this secret." Blee agreed that it was unfortunate. The CIA was obligated to inform policymakers of such important information as soon as it arrived, but the agency had no control over how the White House or State Department handled reporters' questions. Saleh pressed. He knew that Blee and Alex Station had advocated for arms supplies to Massoud, and had earlier taken their arguments to the White House and lost. But the Bush administration had now settled in, and here was a new threat to American intelligence collection on bin Laden. If the Panjshir fell, the CIA would lose a vital listening station. Would America try to save the Council of the North, or would it leave the Panjshiris to their fate? "The decision is that we will fight," Saleh said. "We will not surrender. We will fight to our last man on the ground. This resistance was not about Massoud. It was about something much, much bigger. We will hold." Saleh was putting together a list of the weapons and logistical supplies they needed most urgently. "What can you do for us?" Blee said he understood the question. It was Monday, September 10th, the beginning of a new working week in Washington. He would need a day or two. "Let me come back to you on this," he said.